Impaired memory of childhood. This is one of the markers that I use for identifying trauma. I ask kids, like, what was your life like when you were in preschool? And I get this blank stare. Uh, that tells me that there's something going on with their memory system that may be a result of ACEs. Health risk behaviors, smoking, alcoholism, intravenous drug use. And the important thing to notice is that there's always this logarithmic, there's this linear progression according to how many adverse childhood experiences they're reporting. Now, one of the things that Felitti came out of this, I come from the substance abuse treatment field. He says that the basic cause of addiction is experience dependent. It's not substance dependent. And Gabor Mate is famous for seeing very much the same thing. Respectfully, I have to ask the question, well, where's the research that shows that people who don't have ACEs never become addicted? But anyway, regardless, significant implications for our treatment programs and how we do it. Some of the social problems, and this is why these kinds of things keep churning in the environment and in the family. Looking at unhoused persons, we find that emotional abuse and neglect and household substance abuse are highly correlated with homelessness and mental illness, and therefore with crime. Underlying rape, underlying being a victim of domestic violence, being a perpetrator of domestic violence, the likelihood of having more than 50 sexual partners in a life, elective abortions, likelihood of impregnating a teenage girl. Kids with ACEs are much more likely to wind up in contact with the correction system because of these coping mechanisms. That individuals exhibit higher levels of criminal behavior later in life because they're faced with these trauma responses at a very early age. When you look at, this comes from another presentation that I did very specific to the correction system. But when you look at people who have ACEs, look at the spread between these things. You know, I don't know how many, 8 or 9 times more likely to be incarcerated because if they have a history of psychological abuse. Emotional abuse, more than 4 times as likely to be incarcerated. Twice as likely if they have household substance abuse. So it's important to recognize that these attachment deficits and substance use disorders are almost directly correlated with adult criminal behavior. So again, 21-year-olds who were abused as children meet all of the criteria for at least one psychological disorder. Most of them were abused when they were children. Child maltreatment roughly doubles the probability that an individual is going to engage in any kind of crime as an adolescent or an adult. The risk of childhood crime promotes this antisocial behavior during childhood, following by relationships that value that kind of behavior. And so it just keeps churning and churning and churning. This is the citation where that comes from. So the important thing about understanding how ACEs develop is that the prefrontal cortex, and we're going to go into a little more detail later, but the prefrontal cortex, the thinking, planning, acting out part of the brain, or the planning and executing part of the brain, goes offline. And that's part of that fight or flight response. You know, one of the things that happens when we're under stress is that cognitive functioning part of the brain goes offline, because I don't want to be thinking, I want to be reacting. That's the whole point of the survival brain. And so a lot of the things that we try to do, and even as adults, when these ACEs and the emotional responses get triggered, one of the things that happens is their brain stops working. And to recognize that at that point, they can't hear us. They can't really behave effectively because in a sense, they're back being 5 years old again. And they're reacting the way a 5-year-old did. Anybody who has ever seen an abreaction when you're doing EMDR, that's where it comes from. So what are the things that we can do? We can begin to look at the resilience that helped them survive their childhood. One of the mistakes I think that we make as clinicians is we tend to focus on the problems, right? We have to have a master problem list. We have to have a treatment plan that's tied back to the master problem list. We have to have a progress note that is tied. You all know this. I'm not telling you anything new, but it ignores a very, very key point. And that is that the child developed solutions that worked sometimes. They didn't work as well as some of the ineffective ones, but somehow we have to celebrate the resilience that helped them live long enough to get to my office. And that's really, really important. People come into therapy, hoping that we'll tell them what's wrong so they can fix it. I tell my people what's right with them and how to build on that. So there are these lasting alterations in self-perception. Sexual and violation of these things really alters the jello. It alters the not just the neurochemistry, but the actual physical presence of the brain. And so they last throughout the lifespan. So memory. There are basically four different kinds of memory. The kinds that we're most concerned with here are episodic memory and emotional memory. These things tend to be implicit memories. Remember, when we're under trauma, when we're under stress, the thinking part of the brain goes offline. It's like a fuse blows or a circuit breaker trips. So what happens then is these experiences of trauma are encoded in the brain, but without a story. There's no narrative attached to the feeling. They may be able to tell you what happened, but they can't tell you the feeling. And I'll ask them, what did you feel? What were you feeling when you were listening to your dad beat up your mom? And I get this blank stare because they weren't. I mean, they were feeling it, but it wasn't registering. And we'll talk a little bit more about that later. But this is where the implicit memory, and particularly the stuff that we deal with in EMDR, that's where all of that stuff lives. So just a quick Wheaties box top summary here. For those of you who are old enough to remember, Wheaties box top was the precursor to Twitter. 25 words or less, answer the riddle. It impacts the brain and the nervous system, and most importantly, not just my perception of other people, but my perception of myself, which causes these chronic health behavior problems and social problems. And they really are a major, major public health issue. And often they're just unrecognized or ignored. That's just how it is. So looking at this is, I think, a good way of thinking about this. These overwhelming and tragic experiences can happen at any age, but particularly when they happen early, they're more devastating and long-lasting the earlier in life that they occur. This is where some of that epigenetic loading and stuff comes in. So neglect can have very, very similar experiences. Skill as parents depends on their ability to empathize and connect with their children emotionally, and that they learned from their parents. We all know that people tend to parent the way that they were parented, but this happens at a neurological level. This isn't just conscious learning. So caretaking transmits the childhood experience of parents, the ACEs, if you will, to their children, making a parent's unconscious a child's first reality. Now, this is from Roland Glass, but if you're familiar with Stephen Porges and Deb Dana and polyvagal theory, this is a big part of what they're talking about.